Hello, my name is Xteen and I am a home cook. I am not a professional, although I do work in food, but it's mostly food writing and food marketing. And I'm also not French. But today I'm going to attempt to make classic gougères? 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 Gougères?
Gougères. Gougères.
Which is a baked savory pastry in French cuisine, mixed with cheese and typically served with pre-dinner cocktails or as a finger food at parties. It's all very elegant. I myself decided to make these because I was perusing the New York Times cooking website for recipes, and this comment caught my eye. I wrote it down. In France, groceries carry bags of unbaked frozen gougères. Freezing the prepared unbaked gougères works great, even for several weeks. Making gougères a terrific make-ahead before a party. I like to freeze them on a baking sheet, then transfer them to a Ziploc bag. Guests love them. And this was music to my ears, because I'm having my girlfriends over this weekend for a little garden party, and I was specifically looking for recipes that I could make ahead of time and then bake the day of that would seem impressive and fancy, but not actually be that labor intensive. So this is perfect. Let's see how we do. Our story begins with a brick of Gruyere cheese purchased from Costco. The New York Times recipe for classic gougères by Melissa Clark calls for 5 ounces or 142 grams of shredded Gruyere. So I got right to work mashing this slab of cheese into the side of my box grater, which can only be described as a labor of love. I love cheese, and I am in labor trying to deliver it to my mouth via gougère. After a few minutes, I thought, surely this must be 5 ounces of shredded cheese. My arm is tired. So I grabbed my kitchen scale to investigate, and it was not nearly enough cheese. Back to the box grater I went. This time with a little more force, really trying to show that cheese who's in charge. But unfortunately, still not enough. Back to the grater I went until finally I reached the summit on Cheese Mountain. But unfortunately, I wasn't done grating yet. It's time to attack this hunk of Parmesan, as the recipe calls for 1/3 cup or 50 grams of grated Parmesan cheese. Now, if you try to make these at home, here's an important note. You don't need nearly as much Parmesan as the recipe calls for. I could have certainly stopped here and been just fine. We're only sprinkling it on top of each cheese puff at the end. It's not used anywhere else in the recipe. You really don't need to work as hard as I did, trying to grate exactly 50 grams. I had so much left over, and I had so many regrets. If it looks like a lot of Parmesan cheese in that little bowl, that's because it is. And you really don't need that much. Heed my warning. I don't want you to suffer like I did. Luckily now it's time to make the dough, which was the polar opposite of shredding the cheese. This part goes by super fast. First, add 1 cup of water to a saucepan over high heat. Then, 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter, which is half a stick. That will start to melt, and in the meantime, we need to measure out 1/2 teaspoon of fine sea salt and pour that in as well. And then the recipe calls for 1/8 teaspoon of cayenne pepper, but I don't have a measuring spoon that small, so I just used a little less than 1/4 of a teaspoon. These did not come out spicy at all, don't worry. We want to bring this buttery, watery salt and spice mixture to a boil, and you're going to want to have a wooden spoon handy for the next step, where we will stir in 1 cup of bread flour. So here I am, waiting patiently for my water to boil, minding my own business, and oh, my camera is fogging up a little bit, but it might be okay. No, it's fogging up completely. But now we're back, and the butter water is boiling, baby. So it's time to add the bread flour. Just dump it all in there and get to stirring with your wooden spoon. The dough is going to form really fast. I'm going to show you in real time just how fast it happened. I'm not speeding up this footage at all. I'm just zooming in for dramatic effect. And you can see how quickly everything clumps together, so it's crucial that you're stirring continuously and pulling the dough away from the sides of the pot so nothing burns. But I found this to be super satisfying. As a woman on the go, I appreciated the speediness of this process. And look at this nice, light, and fluffy ball of dough we ended up with. I love it. She looks great. I'm obsessed. Shovel your dough into the bowl of a stand mixer, and the recipe says to beat with a paddle until cooled slightly, about 30 seconds. Who really knows what cooled slightly means, but either way, it's time to add our eggs. We're going to add one egg at a time, letting each one incorporate before adding the next. When you first add each egg, your dough will look really wet like this, and then as it mixes in, it will get less wet and more thick and creamy. That's how you know it's time to add the next egg, or at least that's what I went with. We're adding 4 eggs total, which is a lot to ask in this economy, but if you're trying to impress your friends by baking French cheese puffs, maybe it's worth it? How much do you care about how you are perceived by your loved ones? How badly do you want to eat fancy cheese puffs? These are the important questions. Once all the eggs are incorporated, it's time to add the Gruyere we worked so hard to shred. Get it in there by any means necessary. Continue to beat until it's mostly melted into the batter. This looks mostly melted to me, so I'm going to call it. And there you have it. That's our dough. And we've reached the point in the recipe where shit gets real. We need to pipe our dough into its final form, cute little bite-sized puffs. The recipe suggests doing this by transferring the batter to a large, sealable plastic bag and snipping off one corner. But I thought I would be a fancy little bitch and use this piping bag. So here I am attempting to smear my batter into the bag with moderate success. My hands, they got messy. The bag, it got overfilled. Regrettably, I just kept going. I said, the limit does not exist. Let me see if I can fit all of this batter into this one bag. In the words of the late, great Drake, I started not to give a f*** and stopped fearing the consequence. R.I.P. What's worst of all is that I did not yet realize the gravity of the decisions I had made, so I moved my mixer out of the way and grabbed a baking sheet lined with parchment paper. I'm planning to freeze these cheese puffs overnight and bake them later on, but in order for them to hold their shape, we're going to need to freeze them on a baking sheet first before transferring them to a Ziploc bag. And already you can see that the piping is not working out exactly as I had hoped. Terrible. But I'm still optimistic at this time. I figured I was just getting the hang of it. It always takes a minute to get into the rhythm, and if at first you don't succeed, pipe and pipe again. And I will say that conditions did improve. The recipe says to make each puff 2 teaspoons in size, so I was just trying to eyeball that amount and go with the flow. And look, we were cruising along. I was feeling good, I was brainstorming names for the patisserie that I'm obviously going to open with this newly developed skill set. That is, until disaster struck. The seam on the piping bag split, probably due to the pressure I put her under, and the batter started squeezing out of the side. At first I tried to just ignore the problem. I thought maybe I could just sprint to the finish line with minimal casualties. But the hole only got bigger. Oh no! And as I squeezed the bag, a second, very messy pile of dough began to form next to each of my nicely piped piles of dough. It quickly became clear that this problem would need to be addressed. My puffs were starting to look like shit, and my hands were covered in buttery dough slime. So I pivoted to the method the recipe suggested and transferred my batter to a large Ziploc bag, forcing it all towards the tip, like so, and then cutting off the corner of the bag. And then we were back in business. Unfortunately, these globs of batter look a little less elegant than the ones done with my piping bag and its fancy little tip. But at this point, I just wanted it all to end. I finished squeezing out the rest of the batter and took a long, hard look in the proverbial mirror.
We started off so strong. And then
I also had a little more batter left over after the first baking sheet was full, so I finished it off on a separate tray. Finally, it was time for the last step. sprinkling a little Parmesan cheese on top of each of these. Again, I have no idea why the recipe calls for so much Parmesan. I felt like I was pretty generous with my sprinklage, not to brag, and I still had so much left over. I was also pretty over it at this point, so I was not too precious about how I got the Parmesan on each of these. I just tried to get it on there. Some probably had a little more Parmesan than others. That's just how life works sometimes. But, you know, here they are. These are the finished gougères, ready to be placed in the freezer. Once frozen, I transferred them to a large Ziploc bag, and the next day I baked a couple to see how they came out and do a test run before my friends came over. Maybe I'll bake one ugly one and one more attractive one, just for the sake of experimentation. I have preheated the oven to 425 degrees. We're going to bake for 15 minutes first, then turn the temperature down to 350 degrees, and continue to bake until golden and cooked through for 10 to 15 more minutes. And after all that, here are my finished gougères. Behold. Look at that texture. They're light, they're fluffy, they're cheesy, they're eggy, they're airy. All in all, a delicious little bite. I feel pretty proud. We were mostly successful. Did we have some hiccups along the way? Sure. But what great hero's journey doesn't? I had fun trying this. I hope you had fun watching me try. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.